New semester, new experiences, and a relationship. Look at that. Sure seems like things are looking up right now, huh? I wonder how Junpei's doing. Junpei?
I want you to do something for me.
Huh, looks like he's already on second base. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. This time, episode 5. You saw that montage, right? That's exciting, isn't it? 2 new party members and an entire month and a half to discuss. Surely that means a lot of gameplay stuff to talk about. Well, not quite this time. In fact, the reason why this arc is so exciting is because of how much story is packed within it. And I wasn't too sold on that arc at the beginning, I'll admit, but eventually I came across one clue that allowed me to piece up an entire puzzle, and now I think I figured out something huge as a result of that. Don't worry though, we're still going to talk about gameplay as I have a couple of things to say, but we're going to also talk a lot about the main story today. So much so in fact that I've decided to split it into multiple chapters to talk about different dynamics between different characters. And obviously it's almost tradition now that we have a theory section at the end, so yeah, be ready for that. So with that said, let's talk about gameplay so we have plenty of time to talk about the story later. When it comes to gameplay, one thing I've discovered while playing through this month is the fact that hanging out with your teammates at the dorm is actually a bit more valuable than I first thought. I thought that the main appeal was mostly to get a bit more context and lore about each teammate, as well as get some social stats or some items for doing these things. However, if you spend enough time with a member, they actually unlock a passive ability that enhances their capabilities in combat. I discovered this by hanging out with Yukari enough times, and she actually gets a very strong passive. It reduces the SP cost of her healing abilities, which in turn means that she can heal more, which means that she also gets to charge up 3rd G even faster. So that's really cool. It really plays into the loop and into her character a lot more. Then the second one was Akihiko, and his is a bit lackluster, I would say. It's not bad by any means, but his 3rd G actually charges faster whenever he buffs himself. And this passive basically just increases the effects of the buffs that he puts on himself, which I guess at this point in the game starts to be alright, because he gets buffs that apply to the entire party and not just himself. But still, it's clearly not as good as Yukari's passive. The third one I actually got to unlock was Fuka's, and hers is actually quite powerful as well. Her passive is a straight up flat damage reduction that kicks in whenever your weaknesses are hit, while also applying to the entire party. Now, I don't really know what other members will unlock. I haven't gotten to that point just yet, but this does remind me a lot of the leader characteristics that I mentioned in episode 2. That was a passive unique to Makoto that he got by fusing enough personas in the Velvet Room. If you don't remember what it does, it basically increases the damage you deal whenever you hit an enemy's weakness. And if the same logic applies, then it also means that these abilities from party members get to evolve over time. By that I mean there are multiple ranks to these passive abilities. I say that because I unlocked the second tier of the leader's characteristic as I kept fusing personas in the Velvet Room, which is basically the same thing, but it deals even more damage this time. Speaking of passives, Makoto gets a lot at this point of the game. Some of them are less useful than others, but let's talk about that real quick. Obviously, we've beaten a boss since last time, so we've unlocked a new tarot card. This one is called the Hermit card, and what it does is give Makoto plus 7 SP permanently. Now, while this may sound good on paper, my actual opinion on this is a bit mixed. You see, by this point of the game, you probably already fuse a succubus or any kind of persona that has access to drain spells, specifically the Drain Spirit ability, which allows you to drain enemies' SP and restore your own. That ability on its own only costs 3 SP to cast, but allows you to gain 20 SP back. And there's a matching passive to go along with it, which doubles the amount that you regenerate whenever you use a Drain Life or Drain Spirit spell. So at that point of the game, you will have a persona, most likely, that is able to cast a spell for 3 SP that will regenerate 40 SP from Makoto. So I don't think SP trading management is that big of a deal at this point. Especially if you do run dry, you get the chance of using the clock at the bottom floor Tartarus, but that's, only if you really need it. So trading 7 SP for a slot for a major Arcana card is not really what I would prefer personally. But that's not all, because Makoto also gets access to a couple additional buffs to his ambush ability. If you go back to the guy that sells you sketchy URLs, he will actually give you a new set of URL. These two buff ambush in different ways. The first one guarantees that whenever you strike an enemy from the back during ambush, you will always apply an element to the enemy, while the other increases the amount of 30 that you gain whenever you strike an enemy from the back. These are very minor, I would say. I mean, they're nice to have, but the real game changer was just ambush itself, because being able to strike shadows from the front and still get the advantage is actually quite a big deal, and these are just kind of fluff on top of that ability, but they're nice to have. Now, you also get new 30s as Makoto as you keep fusing. Obviously, you could have gotten those way earlier or way later, depending on how much time you spend in the Velvet Room, but I know that passive abilities is probably not what you're actually hoping for this section. You're probably hoping to hear about the new members, so let's get right on to it. Let's start with Ken. I think he has a pretty interesting kit that mixes both damage dealing as well as supportive skills. He has healing skills, he has protection skills, he has buffing skills, but most importantly, he also has access to light skills, meaning that we now have access to full coverage when it comes to elements. I also find his way to charge up 30 to be pretty cool. The way it works is that whenever you are under half of your maximum amount of SP, then Ken's 30 bar will rise up faster as a result of that, which is an interesting concept, I think, because you are rewarded for, being under half SP, which is not ideal usually, but that implies that during a long expedition through Tartarus, Ken is likely going to be more impactful because he's able to basically make the most of having less SP than other members, which is a really cool concept. Something kind of neat about Ken is that his weapon, which is a spear, deals piercing damage and not slash damage, meaning that now you have two members that can actually use piercing damage as part of their basic abilities. I guess in my mind, I had envisioned that piercing damage would always be something related to, bows and arrows or something like that, so that's kind of neat to have. And with that said, I think I've covered basically everything I wanted to say about Ken, so let's take a look at Shinji now. Shinji's kit is quite weird to see, I'll be honest. He's a pure physical attacker, and well, we already have a lot of these in the party. I mean, we have Junpei, we have Aegis, technically Akihiko could fit in there as well, and even those three get access to some supportive abilities of some kind, but Shinji does not. However, I don't mean to imply that Shinji's kit is boring in any way. In fact, he gets access to a very unique ability called Bloody Charge. It costs a massive amount of HP to cast, 40% of your maximum HP, and what it does is buff your next physical move as well as increase your crit rate. And couple that with the fact that every other skill that he has access to is also a physical move without any way of healing himself whatsoever, it means that he's always going to be pretty low on HP as a result of that, which I agree, that doesn't sound like it's too ideal. However, his Surgy is what complements it quite well. You see, the way that you increase the rate at which it charges up is by having Shinji stay at a relatively low amount of HP. And that fact will actually be quite relevant once we get into the main story part of this video. More on that later. And while it might seem weird to get yet another physical attacker as part of the team, I actually think that he fits a different kind of role. He's kind of niche. For example, he pairs up quite well with Yukari because he's always going to be low on HP, which means that Yukari can also benefit by healing him. Bloody Charge also means that he doesn't actually need to rely on Koromaru's Sturgy to be effective. So while his kit has some quirks to it, I think he shines best in different kinds of lineups and he can be very effective in different ways. I would like to talk more about him, but he only has 4 active abilities to begin with, so there isn't much for me to say here. Therefore, we may as well just move on and talk about the changes that Tartarus has seen throughout this arc. A lot of it is fluff, I would say, but it's still quite nice to have. It does change the dynamic of your exploration of Tartarus a little bit. One of them being Greedy Shadows. Greedy Shadows are rare shadows that will roam around a floor and steal everything they can from the chest within it. What's special about them though is that you don't get to just roam around the floor and find them and fight them like any other shadow. Instead, you have to go through this mini guessing game where you have to pick which direction to go while pursuing the shadow in order to corner them. If you manage to guess the right direction, then eventually you get to fight them and you are rewarded with a ton ton of loot if you manage to defeat them. I think it's neat. It changes the dynamic of your exploration a little bit. The only downside is, well, they're unpredictable, and if you decide not to go on the chase, then you'll miss out on every chest that was on that floor. A second change to Tartarus that was introduced during this arc is dark areas, and it kind of reminds me of certain mutations that you saw in Mementos in Persona 5. This one makes you unable to see very far, and it also makes enemies unable to attack you first, with the downside that the Reaper will spawn way faster on those floors, so you don't have much time. So your priority should be to find the exit, but if you decide to dwell a bit longer on those floors, you will actually be rewarded with something quite special, with Twilight Fragments, and a lot of them actually. Because on those floors, the breakable objects that drop Twilight Fragments are way more likely to spawn. And if you made the choice to pick the Devil Tower card during that night, that means that every single breakable object on those floors will yield 2 Twilight Fragments instead of just 1. And I gotta say, I love this concept. It gives you an opportunity to farm for a very sparse resource, but it doesn't make your life easy because you are under the threat of the Reaper showing up at any time without you having an escape route. And there is one more addition to Tartarus throughout this arc that I found to be quite interesting. You remember how civilians may end up in Tartarus and you are tasked with saving them? Well, I never would have expected that, but your social links can also end up in Tartarus now. And while I didn't dare to play around with that and just see what would happen, I think the game makes it pretty clear that if you don't go out and rescue them, they literally just die and the social link is cut forever. And wow, that actually kind of blows my mind because that is such a bold game design decision, I would say. Because failing to rescue that one social link means permanent damage to your entire playthrough. And yes, the game makes sure that you don't miss out on this information and accidentally ruin your playthrough. Still, it's quite a bold decision. I really like it as a result of that. And that is by far the one change to Tartarus that has surprised me the most throughout this arc. And with that out of the way, I think we should move on and talk about the main story now, starting with a general recap of what has happened throughout this arc. As I was assembling the script for this video, I realized that pretty much everything that happens regarding the main story at this point of the game is quite intertwined between different characters and different subplots. As such, it makes it quite difficult for me to talk about anything without really referencing other events that happen concurrently. So I thought it was in order that we do a little recap of the major events that occurred during this arc so that we can actually delve into each topic a bit more thoroughly. As a point of reference, every event that we're going to discuss occurs between August 20th and September 18th. A lot of important events occur during this period, so let's just take them chronologically for now. On August 20th, 2 events happened. The first one is Junpei meeting Chidori for the first time. Although they haven't established a real connection just yet, this is the basis for everything that's going to unravel later on. In the evening of the same day, Makoto will have a run-in with Takaya at the shrine where they will discuss their motives and ideals. Then, on August 24th, Ken will overhear a conversation between Akihiko and Shinji, which then results in him officially joining Cease by August 28th. Quickly after that, on the 2nd of September, Shinji will also join Cease, and the next full moon is on September 5th. On that same night, Chidori will try and kidnap Junpei under the false assumption that he is the leader of Cease, while the rest of the group will be finding a shadow under the club Escapade. And upon returning to the dorm, they will be confronted by Chidori, who is stopped by Junpei. She is then captured and interrogated by Akihiko as well as Mitsuru. And in the aftermath of this night, Chidori will then be transported to the hospital and kept there for the remainder of the month. And finally, the concluding event I decided to pick for this segment occurs on September 18th, during which a typhoon forces Makoto to return to the dorm very early and encounter Takaya one more time, who is this time a lot more threatening and tells us that we are going to have to fight. And with that, we basically covered every major event that occurs during this arc. So I believe that we are now ready to delve a bit deeper into different characters and the interpersonal relations that are entertained throughout this arc. Let's start by taking a look at the Chidori-Junpei situation first. Let's start by asking ourselves one question. What do we learn from this interaction specifically? Well, first of all, we get to learn Chidori's name. While we already knew that she was acting as part of Strega, we never saw her in action until now. She also remained completely unnamed until Junpei got her to introduce herself. And what I find quite interesting here is that Junpei will get her name not through deception, but through a very normal kind of interaction, really. It takes a couple events between Junpei and Chidori before they actually establish trust. But Junpei will show a lot of interest in into what Chidori is drawing, tries and understand it. And it's only when he gives out his name to her that she actually gives her name back. And despite the fact that she's the enemy, as shown on September 5th, Junpei will remain extremely empathetic with her. In fact, he's the only person that will treat her with humanity while she stays in the hospital. Once he's allowed to go and visit her, he will go quite often, and he's the only one that actually gets her to talk at all. Akihiko and Mitsuru keep trying to interrogate her. They even bring Fuka to try and help, but nothing seems to work until Junpei proposes that perhaps Chidori should be allowed to use her sketchbook again. And something that I find quite compelling in all of this is the fact that clearly Junpei is not over his insecurities about not being a leader. That's why he decides to boast off in front of Chidori to try and impress her. However, I feel as though this could be a redemption arc of sorts for him. Because yeah, being a leader is a big deal. It makes you the main protagonist. But do you need to be the main protagonist to be a hero? In fact, you can be a hero for someone else. And right now, he's doing exactly that for Chidori. He's trying to protect her. He's trying to care for her. In fact, when he finds out that Chidori engages in self-harm, even though her powers allow her to heal pretty quickly, he still begs her to stop, showing that he goes as far as worrying for her well-being. And I wouldn't be surprised if that arc ends up with him understanding that he doesn't need to be at the center of the attention to actually be a hero, which will inevitably trickle down and make him understand that he is worth something as a human being. In fact, if you think about it, he's doing a better job than his seniors are doing right now. No one else has gotten Chidori to say a word until he showed up. And I can see how that could be a turning point for his self-esteem later on. But these scenes involving Chidori actually get us more information about Shinji too. You see, on the 10th of September, we get to witness Chidori being strangled by her own persona. Shinji just so happens to be at the hospital then, and he knows what to do. He gives her some of his medication, which is most likely to be the same medication that he got off Takaya in episode 3. We get to learn that those are called suppressants, which inhibit the power of someone's persona, and Chidori needs it because she doesn't have as much control over her own persona as members of CIS do, and a persona left unchecked will go berserk, turning against their own users, trying to strangle them, kill them, just hurt them in any way possible. While this is unfolding, Akihiko is standing right there in the room. Turns out that he seems to know what suppressants are, and the thought of Shinji using said suppressants angers him so much that it leads into a confrontation between the two of them, one that will turn violent. But why would Akihiko react in such a way? It may not seem out of character for him to react like that, but still, there must be something a bit deeper about that, right? Well, in order to explain that scene, we also have to look at the different linked events that are available with Shinji throughout the month of September. And what's pretty interesting here is that we also get to learn a lot about other characters outside of Shinji. In fact, we get to find out what CIS looked like about 2 years ago. Back then, it was only Akihiko, Mitsuru, and Shinji. And while the trio was not as successful as they are today with us, they were still pretty good friends. And as such, they made promises that they wanted to keep. One of which was that they would graduate together at the same time. And Shinji has not been enrolled into Gekukan for a while now. Most of the linked events that you're gonna see revolve around that idea, trying to get Shinji back into Gekukan. You will be mostly running errands for Shinji as well as for Mitsuru and Akihiko. And thanks to that, Shinji will start to respect you and trust you. He likes the fact that you're sticking up for your own ideas and not just listening to what your seniors have to say. And that's how you find out that there's something quite contradicting about Shinji's behavior here. Because Shinji is not the kind of person that gives up on promises. In fact, when Makoto does something nice for him at the very beginning, he immediately invites him to dinner for the next linked event. And then that promise is kept. During that second linked event, Shinji is very clear that promises are not to be broken. He puts a lot of emphasis on that. Yet, when it comes to that promise that he made with Akihiko and Mitsuru, he is reluctant and unwilling. Eventually, we do get to find out why. Shinji is going to pass away from an illness. He knows that he doesn't have much time anymore. And as far as I can gather, it doesn't seem as though anyone that is part of CIS is actually aware of that fact. Not Mitsuru, not Akihiko, nobody. Only Makoto is made aware of this fact, showing that he puts a lot of faith into Makoto as well as a lot of trust. This is further confirmed by Akihiko saying that Shinji is not the kind of person to open up about his own problems. So while we get to understand more about Shinji here, we still lack some answers as to why he would want to use those suppressants. I mean, he wouldn't say that to Akihiko, obviously, but he doesn't even say that to Makoto either. Well, if you go back to my previous theory that the suppressants serve to make the user unable to perceive the dark hour or something like that, I wasn't too far off, because all it really does is suppress someone's persona. And throughout all these events, something is hinted at constantly. That is that Shinji lost control about 2 years ago and something terrible happened as a result. It seems as though he kind of left the group after that event, so we can consider it to be quite fundamental to who he is today. But as to what actually happened, that is still up in the air right now. We get clues, we get hints, but we don't get any concrete answer just yet. But whereas Chidori needs the suppressants because she cannot control the persona normally, causing it to turn berserk against herself and trying to strangle her, it would seem as though Shinji is not actually suffering from the same issue and is taking the suppressants for another reason, as he is willing to give out his entire stash to Chidori just to keep her stable. So I think I wasn't too far off back then by saying that it was a way of suppressing the dark hour. It may just be a way for Shinji to give up on his own power, to let go of something that he feels is too powerful for him to contain. And the nature itself of the suppressants is what causes the argument. It is during this argument that we get to find out what happened to Akihiko's sister. She died during a house fire that happened while they were still at the orphanage 10 years ago. And the one emotion that Akihiko ascribes to that event is feeling powerless. So powerless, in fact, that he couldn't do anything about the adults that were trying to restrain him from going into the house and saving his sister. And ever since that day, Akihiko's one true goal was always to become stronger, as a way of trying to cope with that death. But Shinji is taking the other way out, refusing to even acknowledge his own power, trying to discard it, trying to suppress it. Not only does it explain Akihiko's reaction here, it also explains why Shinji would feel the need to turn to Strega to get his suppressants. He wouldn't trust Akihiko with that, he wouldn't trust Mitsuru with that. And due to the nature of those drugs, well, it is kind of unlikely that you can just go to a doctor and ask for a refill. But speaking of Strega, it is kind of unclear as to why they would have access to those kinds of medications, why they have so much knowledge about it. And as such, I think it is time for us to take a closer look at Strega, and specifically Takaya, because he does have a couple appearances throughout this arc and they're all quite interesting. While Chidori is being detained at the hospital, Cease is only growing in size, as well as getting ever closer to their stated goal, defeating all 12 Major Shadows and therefore destroying Tartarus. On the 7th of September, a cutscene between Jin and Takaya is shown to the player, where the two of them are plotting a way of rescuing Chidori as well as stopping Cease. But there's a lot more to this cutscene that meets the eye. Starting with the obvious, we already know that Takaya's main philosophy is that if Tartarus were to fall, it would mean that Persona users would lose their power, which is something that he cannot accept, and something that he already tried to weaponize against members of Cease before. Now, if he cannot understand why someone with one persona would be willing to give up on it, then try to juxtapose this ideology with Makoto. I mean, Makoto is the strongest persona user that Takaya has ever met. Not only is Makoto able to maintain control over his own persona, but he's also able to wield multiple at once. And the ways that personas are described by Takaya here would suggest that the personas are actually stronger than the users themselves. So Makoto being so flexible in his use of personas is completely fascinating to Takaya. And through this cutscene, we get to see that this turns almost into an obsession for him. So it makes sense that Takaya just cannot fathom why Makoto would be willing to give up on that kind of power. But we also get to see something else here, a prototype evoker, which implies that this has been in R&D for a while now. He explains that back then it was more common for people to die at the hands of their own persona than be able to use them in combat, which is then followed up by a pretty weird statement. Apparently, Takaya doesn't use an evoker, explaining that he doesn't need to show his resolve in order to summon his persona. We don't get a clear answer as to what he means by that, but this actually kind of ties back into a question I've had since I started playing the game. What is the actual mechanism of an evoker? Why are they shaped like a gun? Why do you have to point them at your head? Why is doing that motion and then pulling the trigger the thing that allows you to summon your persona? So when Takaya is talking about resolve here, does he mean that like he needs to prove something to his persona in order to summon it? And therefore meaning that evokers are a way of showing to your persona that you have that resolve? We know for a fact that some members are kind of scared when they get their hands on their first evoker. So is the trick all about not fearing death? If so, then that could explain why Makoto and Fuka were able to summon the persona for the first time without being explicitly shown how to actually use the device. Again, we don't get full answers here yet, but this is one lead to try and explain what's happening in front of our eyes. We'll make our way back to discussing this evoker in just a minute, but first I wanted to talk about the event that occurs on September 18th, because it shows that Takaya's hand has been kind of forced with what happened with Chidori at this point. Like, sure, there was that one time where he locked us into that bunker for that boss fight in the summer, but when it came to his interactions with Makoto specifically, he has shown himself to be willing to cooperate actually, specifically referring to that one scene on the bridge that occurs on August 14th, the one I mentioned in episode 4. But due to the current circumstances, he's obviously now an enemy, and during that scene on the 18th, he warns us that we'll have to fight eventually. And if you've paid attention to what I said during the recap, there's still one more scene I haven't talked about, the one that occurs on the 20th of August, way before Chidori is even captured. And while he does attempt to change Makoto's mind here, he's still willing to collaborate in a way. He gives Makoto a note saying that his debt is now repaid. Now let's rewind and talk about the prototype evoker again. Don't you think it's a bit odd for him to have access to that kind of gear? We don't even really know who supplies the evokers themselves. Thus far, the chairman is seemingly the one that's giving out evokers to people that join CEAS, but we don't actually know who makes them, let alone know who would be willing to distribute them, and especially give those out to someone that walks around shirtless in the streets with an actual gun attached to his belt. And thinking about that actually reminded me of something that I had noticed back when making episode 4. The chairman is awfully suspicious. I did not bring this up back then because I didn't have proof to actually back that up, but during the summer classes, each member of CEAS got a health checkup at the clinic, and Makoto was last on the list. He definitely got the most extensive checkup out of the entire team, which lasted so late into the evening that he couldn't make it back to the dorms in time before the dark hour, which inevitably led to him meeting with Takaya on the bridge. Now, right before that scene with Takaya, the chairman and Makoto have a little chat at the clinic, and something just felt off about it. Even when reviewing my footage now, I'm not sure what just set me off, but something did. But most notably though, that conversation ends when the chairman gets a phone call, where we get to overhear that some piece of a document was stolen. And I have reasons to believe that the paper that Takaya hands you on the 20th of August is that exact missing piece. It is clearly just one footnote that is part of a larger document. You can tell from the writing style that this is not something that Takaya made himself, and it specifically mentions evokers, as well as special cartridges, which was exactly the language employed by the chairman when he first introduced 3G to the team. But the most unsettling part about this note is what is mentioned at the very bottom, the word test subjects. If the chairman is indeed aware of this document, and perhaps is the one that is actually writing those reports, then the only possible explanation is that CEAS are the test subjects in question. And now I'm starting to question whether the chairman is actually on our side. And my suspicions about the chairman only get confirmed with the introduction of Ken, because multiple members are now questioning whether he actually made the decision himself, or if he was coerced into joining. So without further ado, it is now time for us to talk about Ken. Now, trust me when I say that Ken specifically is quite the enigma thus far. Despite the fact that he's been living with us for the entirety of the summer break, his decision to join CEAS comes right after a very particular conversation happens between Shinji and Akihiko, which Ken just happens to overhear. We're gonna talk about that in more depth very quickly, but first I just wanted to touch on the fact that Ken's decision to join CEAS puts Akihiko in a very tight spot for some reason. He doesn't seem comfortable with that decision at all. And it's not just because of Ken's young age, because every member shows a bit of shock at the thought that Ken could be part of the team, but Akihiko reacts in a more visceral way, and it's Ken's decision to join CEAS that will finally convince Shinji to rejoin as well, and the two of them seem to share the same concern. Was the decision really taken out of his own volition, or was he forced into joining? It's not the first time that we see that members seem to be kind of just rushed in. That's something that Yukari actually called out Mitsuru for. She worried that Fuka was just rushed in without actually being given a choice, really, which now puts even more suspicions around the chairman and his intentions. But now let's talk about Ken himself. I don't think it's a coincidence that Ken joining CEAS is what is actually going to push Shinji to rejoin as well. And after having spent so much time trying to brainstorm this episode and putting it together, I believe to have uncovered the reason why Shinji decided to rejoin CEAS right after Ken's introduction. Now hear me out. Have you ever heard of the term Chekhov's gun? If not, then let me just explain real quick. Chekhov's gun is a narrative principle that basically states that if something is to be directly mentioned in the story, it is going to play a role later and become relevant. So for example, if an author takes the time to mention a gun in the story, you can expect it to become relevant later on. Now that could take on many different forms. It could be that the gun is going to be shot at someone later, or maybe it's going to simply be used to threaten someone or to intimidate them. Or it could be the source of a quid pro quo for the protagonist, like for example the gun being planted on their person, which causes them to be chased by the police or something like that. And while the author may not make the role of this gun very clear to the reader just yet, the idea stays the same regardless. You can assume that this gun is there for a reason. And remember the scene that I talked about earlier with Shinji and Akihiko, specifically about Akihiko's sister? Her death serves a fundamental role into who Akihiko is today, yet she's not given a name. So while the events surrounding her are important to the story, her actual identity and who she was and her name, that's not actually relevant. And if you think about it from the writer's perspective, that makes sense. You don't want to confuse your reader by just introducing too many characters at once that may not actually be relevant to the plot at all. And therefore, names are only given whenever a character is necessary to understand the plot. And it turns out that there's a name that we've only seen once thus far that comes back. And that comes back during the conversation that Shinji and Akihiko have, which leads to Ken joining Cease later on. And that name is Miki. Okay, but what if Miki is actually Akihiko's sister? I mean, the only time that name was mentioned before is during a conversation between Akihiko and Shinji.
You, me, Miki.
But we can confirm that they're not the same person because Shinji clearly makes a distinction between the two of them. He also mentions that whatever happened to Miki, it happened 2 years ago, which is a time frame that we've seen before. If you recall when Ken was first introduced to the party right at the beginning of the summer break, he explicitly says that his mom passed away 2 years ago. And I have reasons to believe that the writers of this game intentionally put a red herring when she was first mentioned by Akihiko. Look at the context in which she's first mentioned. In that specific line, what's the first thought that you have in mind? Miki, Shinji, Akihiko just roaming around? To me, at first I thought that must mean that Miki must have been the same age as them, but nothing here actually disproves the idea that she could be much older than them. What if Miki was actually a caregiver or an elder, but specifically someone that could have given birth to a child 10 years ago? And yes, you've guessed it, this is exactly where I'm going with this. My theory as it stands right now is that Miki is actually Ken's mother. And while we don't know what happened to her exactly just yet, we can know for sure that Shinji is responsible in some way. And I think the final proof that ties all of this together is the fact that Shinji recognizes Ken not by his first name, but by his surname, Amada, meaning that he may not know Ken personally, but he sure as hell recognizes that surname. And throughout all of these interactions, in the linked events and whatnot, it's clear that what happened then with Miki was not an accident. Shinji believes that he did it, that he's responsible for what happened, and that he needs to be held accountable for it. And that would explain everything. It explains why Ken joined Cease to begin with. It explains why Shinji was finally convinced to rejoin, and it also explains why he's so riddled by guilt. And that is the theory I'm willing to present to you today. Sheesh. Quite the theory to just end episode 5 on, isn't it? Phew. Let me tell you, this episode was quite difficult to put together. There are a couple reasons as to why. One of which is just art block that just has to happen eventually. But I also came to realize that the structure I had been using to conduct these reviews thus far is likely not going to cut it anymore for the rest of the series. I think now is a good time to just talk about the future of the series. It seems to me that the gameplay at this point is pretty much set in stone, and that now the game is starting to put a lot more emphasis around its story. As such, I kind of doubt that later episodes will feature like a dedicated gameplay section or a dedicated Cease section. So I'll just have to brainstorm and figure out a new way of doing these videos. I already kind of ran into that issue here with this episode because I know it's not interesting to just listen to the events like chronologically. So I tried to be a little bit more creative here and figure out a way of talking about these events in a different order, which took a lot of time to figure out, I'll be honest. I expect future episodes to be a bit more character focused perhaps, like deep dives on a certain character or something like that. I may also consider the idea of making a recap episode eventually. It's also important to address the success that episode 4 was. I cannot thank you enough for just checking it out and for sharing it and for liking it and for all the feedback I got for it. It has become the most viewed episode in the series and that's just incredible to me. But it's difficult for that not to skew my expectations recommendations for later episodes. Obviously, I would want the series to keep getting better and better with each new episode, but that's exactly how you fall into the trap of wanting your episode to be perfect before releasing it, and eventually you simply get stuck and don't release anything at all. So I decided it was time for episode 5 to come out. Even if it doesn't end up performing as well as I wanted to, that's fine. There's always episode 6, and then after that there will be episode 7. So you just gotta keep going. I also wanted to take the time to thank my collaborators, and yes, plural this time, for making this episode possible. Not only was their assistance crucial for the making of this episode, getting to assemble a team together like that, it's such an awesome feeling. It's quite wholesome to see my work garner so much attention like that, and I never would have expected that people would be willing to partake in it like this. So if you've been enjoying the series, please go out and thank those guys for their work. Their names are on screen right now, and if you want to find out more about them, please check the links in the description down below. It was a great pleasure to work alongside them for this video. And with all of that said, I wanted to just thank you, the viewer, for watching this video. If you've enjoyed the video, then please consider watching the other episodes in the series, as well as leaving a like or subscribing. That always helps me out. And I hope that you stick around to watch episode 6 or perhaps the recap. And with that said, it's time for me to say peace out.